So we're in Megillah, page 11, Yud Aleph. And as I recall, we are at 11A2. Okay, and we're going to start from, it makes sense for me to start from the left-hand side, the bottom of the column, where it goes, the Gemara continues to interpret the first verse. So we're still on the very first verse of Megillas Esther, and let's see what we have here. Is somebody going to read for us, please? Going once, going twice. All right, Bill.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes.
You got me.
Yeah, I can see how twisted your arm is. Go.
The Gemara continues to interpret the first verse of Megillat Esther. Vayehi bimei Ahashverosh. And it was in the days of Ahashverosh. Rav said, the word Vayehi is a combination Vai, woe, and he, mourning. With reference to this, it is written, and you will sell yourselves there to your enemies as slaves and bondwomen, etc.
Okay, so first of all, as the note sort of indicates, what we're now going to do, we had until now a series of ptichtaot. A ptichta is the opening way that a person who would give a public drasha, a public exposition on some Torah matter, how they would begin. And there was a kind of a classic way to do it, which is that you do it so artfully by coming from some other end, right? From some other verse that's in a completely different part of the Torah, part of the of the Bible, of the Tanakh, and then somehow or other you relate it to the subject at hand. Now we're going into a different format. Now we're going actually into we imagine everybody's got a Megillat Esther in front of them. And now what we're doing is we're reading verse by verse. And as we read verse by verse, we're going to have different sages commenting on the verse. So it's a little bit of a different literary approach, and very much, again, in keeping with Midrashic traditions. And it's a little bit more of a literary rather than an oral genre, right? The oral genre was, you imagine the rabbi getting up and giving the sermon, and we have the record. Look at how cool it was that the rabbi started over there and ended up back over where we are. That's very much of a sermonic kind of question. That's a performance thing. Now we're simply, it's as if you have a book with the verses on the top half of the page, and then you've got comments on the bottom half of the page, offered by different people. So here we go with Rav. So Rav gives us the comment that Vayehi, the very first word of the Megillah, is a combination of woe and mourning. This echoes stuff that we had before, remember? We had a whole discussion of whether the word Vayehi is always introducing some sad or negative phenomenon, historical episode, era, something like that, right? And then we said, wait a second, it depends. Not every Vayehi is bad, right? There are Vayehis that are very, very good. Good things happen with Vayehi. So then they said, the modification was, yeah, but there is no good Vayehi bimei. If it says Vayehi in the days, and it happened in the days of so-and-so, that's always bad. Every example that we have from Tanakh is an example of something unfortunate happening, or a catastrophe, or something bad. So here Rav is part of that whole discussion, and he's saying that he wants to add to how terrible the beginning of this book is. And again, we're not, when we collect ourselves to listen to the Megillah, my experience over all the years is that there's a sense of excitement, there's a sense of fun, there's a sense of happiness. We're coming to celebrate Purim, and the Purim joy is the overall context for everything that we do. And then when we get to Haman's name, we blot out his name, but we blot out his name. It's fun. We make noise. We yell. We stamp our feet. We do groggers. We have a very, very fun approach to doing these things. But actually, underneath all of that fun, there is this alternative thread, which is sad, or which is about the fact that there's risk, that there's danger here, that there was panic, that there was anxiety. The fun comes post facto. After we actually realize that we got out of it, then we're very happy. But as it was happening, it was not fun. As it was happening, there was very, very serious, challenges that we had to face. So Rav says, let's look at the verses as telling us the story as it's happening. Right? There used to be a show when I was a kid. You are there.
Yeah.
So to imagine ourselves without knowing ahead of time what the end of the story is, even though we do, but suspend that part of our knowledge and go into this from the moment to moment reality of the story. So he says, if that's what we're going to do, then we should take to heart that this Megillah begins actually at a terrible moment for the Jews. So we don't usually take that to heart so much. What's so terrible? What's the woe and the mourning? What's that all about? So we have a proof text here. We have a verse that is brought in to speak to this. But just before we get to the verse itself, what is Rav alluding to? What is the historical context of the opening of the Purim story? The context is, this is a story about Persia, right? The king of Persia. But the Persian Empire is an empire that takes over from the Babylonian Empire. And the Babylonian Empire destroyed Jewish sovereignty and exiled the Jewish people from their land, destroyed the temple. That was the Jewish, center of religion. So we are still, this is not ancient history in when the Purim story is happening. It's recent history. It's history that is still in the lived experience of the Jewish people. So the Jewish people who are subject to Achashverosh, when we have this party that opens up the the story, if you think about sometimes very operatic kinds of things or theatrical things, the curtain is opened and everybody's happy and everybody's running around, bustling around and giggling and clinking glasses and so on. So there's all of this joyousness, but actually underneath it, there is, for the Jewish people, a terrible situation. What's the verse that gets quoted here? And you will sell yourselves to your enemies as slaves and bondsmen. So look at note 28.
Note 28 from Deuteronomy. This verse is from the passage in the Torah that depicts the dire punishment that will befall Israel for not observing God's commandments.
The section is called the Tochacha, the admonition, right? And this is the Deuteronomy version. There's one in the end of Vayikra, Leviticus, and there's one here in Deuteronomy. And it's about, if you don't listen to God, if you don't follow God's ways, then you will suffer terribly. So this verse is part of that. And exile is, of course, one of the main punishments that this Torah portion tells us. You don't live in the land. You don't get to live in the land if you don't stay loyal to God. And that's where we are in the Purim story. We are in the fresh beginning of exile. Go ahead.
The verse continues, Ve'ein koneh, but none will buy. This prophecy found fulfillment in the time of Haman, who decreed that no one may purchase a Jew as a slave. That's according to Rashi. The verse implies a double tragedy. Not only will you be offered for sale as slaves, but none will buy you for that purpose. Instead, they will buy you to kill you. This too was fulfilled in the time of Haman, as Esther told King Ahasuerus, for we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, slain, and annihilated. Had we been sold as slaves and bondwomen, I would have kept quiet. This double tragedy is alluded to by the double expression of grief contained in the word vayehi, woe, and he, mourning.
Right. So this is Rav sort of like, splashing cold water in our face and sort of saying, look, this is not a good time. And it's not just when Haman finally gets Ahasuerus to agree to his plot to destroy the Jews, but that plot was made possible by the tenuous situation of the Jews in the empire to begin with. So we'll get to it, and we've mentioned it already, that when they're having this wonderful party, when we read the Megillah, we read one verse that when they're drinking from vessels, different kinds of vessels, various vessels, bechelim mechelim shonim. Everybody's drinking from all kinds of. This one is drinking from a goblet. This one person is drinking straight from the bottle. Everybody's drinking, right? It's this like, orgiastic, drunk fest. And we read that phrase, that verse, with the trop of Eicha, of Lamentations, because the vessels that people are drinking from are the temple vessels. The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, and the spoils of war were taken away and brought to Babylonia, and then, of course, they were just respoiled, or whatever the word is, by the Persians, and that's what's being used here. So instead of it being used for sacred purposes, they're being used for this completely decadent situation. The verse that's being cited, you'll sell yourselves there to your enemies, and no one will want to buy you. So this is, actually even more awful than what the note talks about. The note talks about the fact that you'll be put on the slave block, and nobody will be interested in buying you to make use of you as a worker. They'll buy you maybe to work you to death, but not to have you as a productive part of their labor force. And hold on a second, and I'll see what David has to say in a second. But this is also, yes, this is again the word ve'ein koneh, the word koneh, to acquire. The same thing we had it earlier this morning in Pirkei Avot. But it's also the idea of offering yourself in desperation, because that's the only way that you might be able to get some food to eat. You're offering yourself as a slave, and nobody's interested. No, you really don't have anything to offer. Or, alternatively, like we say to, the phrase, sell yourself to the devil, right? We're selling ourselves to our enemies. We're saying, okay, you know what? We want to fit in. We want to be part of this society, and that's also part of the rabbinic picture of what's going on in this party, is that we want to laugh and socialize with everybody and try desperately to be part of the in crowd, even if it's at the expense of experiencing our own humiliation or our own degradation. And this is a well-known phenomenon as well, when people put up with slights, put up with discrimination, and make believe they don't hear the insult, because they want to fit in. They want to somehow hope that if they keep on playing along, it'll be okay. All right. So that's Rav, and now his contemporary and his partner in teaching Torah, they often disagree, Rav and Shmuel. So Shmuel now offers something else.
And Shmuel introduced his lecture on Esther with an exposition of the following verse.
Right. Now that's not a very accurate translation. The translation that we have of the printed text in the Gemara is Ushmuel Amar. Shmuel said. There's a little over interpretation here. in our edited English. Go ahead.
An exposition of the following verse. I will not have been revolted by them, nor will I have rejected them to destroy them.
Okay, so this verse is part of the end of the admonition section. And this is God's assurance that no matter how angry I am with the children of Israel, no matter how much I will bring pain and suffering to the children of Israel, in the end, I won't completely wipe them out. I won't completely reject them. I won't be so disgusted with them that I'll just throw them away finally, right? There is an end to the suffering, and there will be a restoration of the Jewish people to their homeland and to their relationship with God. That's the nechama, the comfort. And we have that, when we go into the period of time that goes till Tisha B'Av. So we have a whole bunch of prophetic readings that warn us and that tell us terrible things. And then after Tisha B'Av, we have consolation haftorahs. So the 3 weeks between Shivasar B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, we have 3 harsh, haftorahs that really lace into us as a people. And then we have 7 haftorahs after that calm us down, try to make us feel better, try to give us hope and strength that no, everything is not lost. There's always, tomorrow is always another day, and we can make up with God. So that's the verse now that Shmuel is taking, rather than the verse that Rav is taking. Rav took a verse of admonition, of condemnation. Shmuel is taking a verse of consolation and comfort. And now he starts parsing it.
The verse is interpreted phrase by phrase. I will not have been revolted by them in the times of the Greeks, nor will I have rejected them in the times of Nebuchadnezzar. To destroy them, this refers to the times of Haman. To break my covenant with them in the times of the Persians, for I am Hashem their God. This refers to the times of Gog and Magog.
Okay, there's a note that probably the better reading is, because Haman is the time of the Persians. So when we say to the time of Haman, and then we say to break my covenant with them in the time of the Persians, that probably should be in the time of the Romans. That's, the subsequent empire, right? And then that's the historical empires that oppressed us. And then Ki Ani Hashem Elokeichem, that's in the time of Gog Umagog, that's Armageddon. And that's the final period right before the Messiah will come, right? So this is breaking down the verse to say that God is with us no matter how terrible the period is, no matter how oppressed we are, no matter what kind of political and military and just physical pain and that we're being subjected to. God is with us, and God doesn't give up on us, and eventually God will redeem us. Okay, and now that, since we're on that verse, we continue.
The Gemara presents a different interpretation of this verse. In a Baraita, it was taught.
Okay, and a Baraita should probably be earlier than Rav and Shmuel. Right, Rav and Shmuel are at the generation right after the Mishnah. Oh. These times are not hard and fast, that's it, finished. But in general, a Baraita comes from the time of the Mishnah. So this is an earlier text than Shmuel's text, right? An earlier teaching than Shmuel. Go ahead.
In a Baraita, it was taught, I will not have been revolted by them in the times of the Chaldeans, for I appointed Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah to save them. Nor will I have rejected them in the times of the Greeks, for I have appointed Shimon the righteous, the Hasmonean, and his sons, and Matityahu, the Kohen Gadol, to save them. To destroy them in the times of Haman, for I appointed Mordechai and Esther to save them. To break my covenant with them in the times of the Persians, for I appointed the scholars of the school of Rabbi and the sages of the various generations to save them. For I am Hashem their God in the time to come, when no nation or people will be able to dominate the Jews.
Okay. So this gives us not just the fact that this is an assurance that God is with us, but examples of how God is with us. What are those examples? What do the examples show us? How do these examples give us God being with us?
Well, God sends agents to act on his behalf, I assume.
Each example is actually human beings. Each of these examples historically is about some hero, some person of principle who was willing to lay their life down for the sake of standing up for Jewish principles, for the Torah, right? So all of these examples, first of all, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and Daniel, right? So this is the time of the Babylonian exile, called here the Chaldeans, right? And they were willing to die for God. Were willing to die for the Torah. Miraculously, they didn't. So on the one hand, we have God's presence in the fact that God made the lions quiet down when Daniel was in the lion's den, and God made the fire not burn Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So that shows that God was with us. But we'll see as we keep on going that the human element is progressively more prominent than the divine element. That first example, you could argue either way. Is it Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah that are people that are devoted to God? That's God's presence, or the miracle? But then look at the next example. The next example is the time of the Greeks. Who do we have? Shimon HaTzadik, Chashmonayu Vanav, Umatityahu Kohen Gadol. So we have all of these priests who are priestly leaders of the people, who are righteous, as opposed to the corrupt priests that were also on the scene then and later. So there are, yes, we have the Hanukkah miracle as told by the Talmud, but in general, what we're talking about here is people who are devoted to God, who don't give up, who are willing to fight for God, who are willing to stand up for God, who are willing to martyr themselves for God, with no real obvious intervention by God. And of course, it gets even stronger when we get to the Purim story, right? When we get to the Purim story, what's God's presence exemplified by?
Mordecai and Esther.
Mordecai and Esther. No miracles, no obvious intervention by God at all. We can't even make up a miracle like the miracle of the oil and the menorah, right? Here, there's absolutely no presence, and literally, as we know, no mention of God in the whole story. So the presence of God here, gradually, from the first step to the second step to the third step, we've now gotten to the point where there is no God that you can point to with a finger and go, look, here's the lightning, and here's the thunder, and here's the special miracles, and here's all of the divine presence. It's all about human beings making God their God, to be repetitive of the Torah sparks that I was talking about this Shabbos. And then the last one, the fourth one, right? To break my covenant with them in the time of we have to change this from Persians to Romans again. And what does it say? What's the example here?
Appointed scholars of the school of Rabbi and the sages of the various generations.
Right. So this is also the clear giveaway that we're talking about the Roman period, not the Persian period. There was no Rebbe. There were no rabbis in the time of the Persians. So what's the divine presence? How do we know that God hasn't given up on the Jewish people? Because there are rabbis. Right. So easy for me to say.
Indeed.
But that's what. All right, Merle, we'll understand. Take what you can get.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So the statement that the Gemara is making here is God's presence is manifest through the fact that we have a community of scholars who are devoted to teaching the Torah. That's God's presence. Nothing coming out of the heavens breaking open or anything. It's people totally dedicated to to teaching God's word. And of course, there's one more step down, so to speak. Right? As I said, the beginning, we have a little bit more of a sense that God is obviously around with the miracles that God does for Daniel and for Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then we have a little bit less of a presence with God, with the Chashmonaim and so on. And then we have even less of a presence that's obvious with Mordechai and Esther. But in each of those three cases, there is at least some sense of a salvational moment. Right? In each of those three cases, Daniel, Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, and the Chashmonaim, they saved the Jews. And of course, Mordechai and Esther, they saved the Jews from destruction, from death. What is Rabbi and his cohort of scholars? What salvation have they brought? Here it's less obvious than ever. The salvation is simply that the Jewish people have a way, if they choose, to continue to live as Jews, to continue to have a meaningful Jewish life. It's not about life and death anymore. Rebbe didn't save the Jews from death. Rebbe saved the Jews from stopping being Jews. Right? So we've come to a different kind of salvation. Right? Rabbinic Judaism was a spiritual lifesaver and an identity lifesaver. It saved the Jewish people's identity, but it didn't save their lives. They would have just, they could have assimilated and continued off into all of the other, groups that they were part of. Okay, and then finally, the last one is the Messianic period, right? Gog and Magog, no one will be able to be, to dominate the Jewish people. Okay, any comments up to now? Anybody have anything to add? Yes, Josie. I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Is this the philosophy of those who continue to believe after the Holocaust, which was the big tragedy of our times? This idea that no matter how bad things are, there's still God and God is with us, because I've always wondered about that.
Right, there's a term, Sheirita Pleta, which is translated as the saving remnant.
Yeah.
There's somebody that's left, right? Even in the worst situation, the worst kind of destruction, it's not complete. There's somebody, some group, some community, some individual that's still around to pick themselves up and to start again or to continue again, right? And that's absolutely where we are. That's exactly where we are. The question is how, and Jewish continuity is like this watchword that has been, a topic for a generation or more. The question is, how well are we going to succeed in continuing? I don't know if people saw, there was an article in the Times a week or more ago that the world population itself is beginning to shrink. And that in major parts of the world, the world is not reproducing itself. So China, for instance, is losing population. The shocker was, it said that maybe by the end of the century, there's a possibility that Nigeria will have more people than China. Because there are certain places where the world populations are still growing. Africa is still a place where world population, where the population is growing. But in the West is shrinking. There isn't a single Western country, in Europe and the United States, of course, where the population is maintaining itself. Forget about growing. It's less and less people. And this is a problem for the Jewish people. How do we continue if there are no Jews to continue Judaism, if there's no Jews to continue to be Jews? So except for the Orthodox world and except for Israel at this point, the Jewish people is not reproducing itself. The Jewish people is shrinking. And of course, there are all kinds of other ramifications. That means that we're getting older rather than having young people around and so on. But also just there's fewer and fewer Jews to keep going. So the remnant question is a very, very serious question, not just in terms of which Jews take Judaism seriously, which Jews identify as Jews, but just how many Jews are there? Are there people to be? Are there enough people in the world to actually be Jews? You know, you can't have a kosher supermarket if nobody wants to buy kosher food. You know, you can't have a shul if there are no Jews around. So that's the question. And the way this step-by-step Raita goes, it becomes more and more a question of us, right? It becomes more and more a question of human involvement. God's presence, God's saving presence is now more and more placed in the heart of the Jewish person and the choices that the Jews make. So there's a transition and a gradual progression into putting it into our hands. Okay.
Just one, a little bit unrelated point, but I've always been struck by the frame that we put around various tragedies. So if you think about the Holocaust, you know, the most catastrophic event in Jewish history, and yet it led to the establishment of the State of Israel and the great reflowering of the Holy Land. So if you broaden the frame enough, you can find in tragedy some redeeming qualities. Same thing with the Babylonian exile, leads to the flowering of the Babylonian Talmud and eventually the return to the Second Temple. So in the case of Purim, you don't really need to broaden it that much because the story itself has its own redemption or triumph within it. But I don't know. I don't know what the lesson is. Maybe that there's a but there's a matter of perspective and framing that I think is inevitable when you have these kinds of tragedies.
This is an ongoing discussion throughout the generations, certainly in modern times. There was a Jewish philosopher, he died, I don't know, 50 years ago, Shimon Ravidovich. He taught at Brandeis University when Brandeis was first started, came from Europe, and he wrote an essay called The Ever-Dying People.
Oh, yeah.
And his point was that we're always kvetching that we're at the brink of extinction, we're at the brink of disaster, and somehow or other we always keep on going, and it's like part of our historical and spiritual DNA to be constantly in anguish over, oh no, what's happening? Well, where are we going to be tomorrow? But so what do you do with that? What do you do with that big global, or pan-historical perspective that you started bringing up and that I'm pushing along? Does that, what do you take away from that? So one way to respond is, so just calm down. Everything has the flip side of it. The developments come, in unforeseen ways, and we've always had some positive development that followed on the heels of the terrible developments. So there's a danger, to my mind, of a kind of developing a kind of a bird's eye view complacency of approaching this kind of stuff. Things will work out. There will always be a saving remnant. There will always be some kind of new development that will be okay. So to give an analogy, analogies are always flawed and are always up to argument. Over the last generation, people that have been raising concerns about climate crises have been resisted by many people who say, we've always had problems and we've always figured out how to solve them. We've always been able to, figure out some new technology, some new system, some new everything, and that's what we're going to do. We have it. We'll figure it out. We'll get it, and as a result, that approach keeps on delaying actually doing stuff. So your perspective can be a kind of a tranquilizer that stops people from actually taking the actions that will be required in order to have that silver lining develop or that new next positive thing. The state of Israel didn't come about after the Holocaust because people said, you know what, after the Holocaust, let's not be too concerned. There's always a good thing that happens afterwards. That's not why everybody had to fight and sweat and die to create and not give up hope in order to do that. So in order to make a state. So the human endeavor is always urgent. And it's always also urgent to recognize the pain and the suffering and the cost that's involved in the human experience. When we say, oh, look, the destruction of the Second Temple, let's not be so sad about it, because after all, look what we got. We got Rabbinic Judaism. Isn't that great? It was worth it. That's like the implicit way of that comes out of that. Now, of course, it's a little unfair, but that's still, I think, actually a strong way of putting the way some people. I can't cry, for what happened, on Tisha B'Av, because look at how much better off we are now. And to me, that's like horrifyingly unfeeling. This is what the communist revolution was all about. Why should we worry about millions of people dying when the result is going to be, this great paradise? So it'll be worth it. It'll be fine. When do we say no? Let's actually recognize that the human realm that we live in.
You have to break a few eggs to make an omelet.
That's right. Hey, and who doesn't love an omelet, right? So
God bless Mao Zedong.
Right. So I think that there's a danger in that kind of like bird's eye view thing, because the bird's eye view thing in the end is about disengaging. You can't have a bird's eye view perspective unless you step out of the picture.
Right. But theologically, though, the idea that God will protect us in the end, I mean.
But what I'm saying, so coming back to these Rav and Shmuel.
Right.
It's not a feel-good thing. It's a tragic perspective, because it's saying, yes, God will be there in the end, but at what cost? Look at how many times we've had to be, sold into slavery. Look at how many times we've died. Look at how many, not just the sinners, but the good people that have had their blood shed and that have had the losses that we've suffered.
Yeah, I mean, even going back to Noah, the flood, and
exactly.
Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, all those things are tragedies that, in some sense led to better times, but it's pretty deeply embedded in our theology.
If we give up all hope, then there's no hope, right? That's the tautology, but there is no future. If we just, constantly just sit with our wounds and with our pain, then we can't go forward, and we're not going to be able to do that stuff. But we have to walk, with both of those things, with the pain and with the tragedy, and with the resolve to not let it defeat us. And again, not to give up. What does it say about God? The theological question, right? if God is a God that makes, this cycle of pain and suffering and violence possible, so what good is that kind of a God? That's a very powerful argument. This argument says, you may not like it, but guess what? God is still there, and God still does care. And I'm going to embrace that against all evidence. I say it every Yom Kippur when we do the martyrology. I read out a document from one of the people that survived the Spanish expulsion. And this person says, God, you're really working hard to make me lose faith in you. And you know what? I have 2 words for you, God. And it isn't happy birthday. I'm not losing faith in you, no matter what you do. So take that. So that's this person's revenge against God, is to not give up their faith in God. It's this cussed stubbornness of saying, that's it. I'm a Shomrei Emunah. I'm a guardian of the faith. I'm not going to let anybody take it away from me. I'm going to tell the story. I love to tell the story, so I tell it anytime it comes to mind. So Zelda works with a filmmaker occasionally, who is the child of Holocaust survivors. And his parents already have passed on. But he made film. He filmed his interactions sometimes with his father, not his mother. His mother died earlier, and his father was a pious Jew. And he has this. For me, it's just I can never think about it without being moved. I imagine it, and I can see it in my imagination. The camera focusing on this man, this old man, who just really looks like a Jew. He's got this, and he was a worker. He wasn't a rabbi, and he wasn't anything fancy schmancy. He was a physical manual worker like Jews used to be. And at the end of his life, he looks more like a rabbi. He's got his beard. He was in a wheelchair. He couldn't take care of himself anymore. And our friend asks him. He says, Mom lost her faith. She practiced a completely faithful Orthodox Jewish practice, but she believed nothing. And the whole time she's preparing the Seder, she's like cursing God, and saying, and she made it. She did it, but she didn't accept anything of it. And he says to his father, he says, Tati, he says, and you had so many friends who lost their faith because of the Holocaust. And you didn't. How do you explain it? How do you explain that you didn't lose your faith when so many of the people who are close to you and so many people went through the things that you went through, they did lose their faith? And this is old man, and the image is it's just his head in the frame, and his eyes get really big. And he goes, it's a miracle. That's his answer. It's a miracle that I didn't lose my faith. That's all. All right. We're up to 11A3, Rabbi Levi.
Rabbi Levi introduced his lecture on Esther with an exposition on the following verse. But if you will not drive out the inhabitants of the land.
Okay, let's look at the whole verse. So look at note number 36.
Note number 36, Numbers 33:55. The verse in its entirety reads, but if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come to pass that those who remain shall be barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and shall harass you in the land in which you settle. Scripture relates in 1 Samuel 15 that Saul, king of Israel, was commanded to annihilate the nation of Amalek. Saul balked at this command and did not destroy the Amalekites.
All the Amalekites.
As a result of Saul's misplaced compassion, Israel was punished in the times of Haman. That's Rashi's interpretation. Saul spared Agag, king of Amalek, although Agag was killed soon after by the prophet Samuel In the meantime, he fathered a child from whom Haman was descended.
Right? Haman is called Haman Ha'agagi. Right? Haman the Agagite.
Agagite.
Right?
That's
The descendant of Agag. So Agag was the king of the Amalekites. So Haman was Amalek. Haman was a descendant of Amalek. So when the note says, therefore the Jews were punished by Haman, what they're saying is he didn't wipe out Amalek. Saul, out of his sense that, okay, enough is enough. So we did our job. As a result, Haman was able to survive, obviously as a further descendant much, much later. And then, was able to hatch his plot to destroy the Jews, which is what Amalek is dedicated to doing. So this is Rabbi Levi's pointing it out, that this is how history develops, and it's a very paradoxical kind of teaching. And Saul, we had a little bit talking about Saul earlier this morning in the Pirkei Avot. Saul is a heartbreaking figure in many, many, many ways. And this is the place where finally the straw, that breaks the camel's back. This is the time when he loses his future to be the king of Israel and to be the person who establishes the dynasty for the Jewish people. And he loses it in this kind of like sad way where he's too nice a guy. He's too much of a softie. And he, the overall story is he listens. He says to Shmuel, the people didn't really want to do it. They felt that it was enough. We did enough already. But the message in the Tanakh, in the Bible, is that because of that, he brought untold suffering later. Right? Because he wasn't willing to do this now, we paid the price later on. So that's one of the paradoxes here. The other paradox is we were just talking about the saving remnant. Mm. Haman is the destroying remnant. Mm-hmm. Right? Haman is the few remaining people that survived Amalek, destruction. But guess what? The same way that we survive the Jewish destruction, hoping to create a Jewish people serving God, an Amalekite who survives will survive hoping to destroy goodness, right? To destroy the Jewish people. Right? So these are the kinds of heritages that are on both sides, the flip side of the coins. Josie, yeah.
Yeah, well, we have a discussion in the 929 Bible study group where...
What are you up to now? Where are you? In Proverbs, I think, right?
Yes, but when we were reading...
We're just starting Job today.
Ooh. I don't envy you.
But one of our members is always very upset about these commands to wipe out Israel's enemies and destroy them, men, women, children, everybody. Right. And this particular passage made me think of those discussions of why it's important to follow God's command and wipe out your enemies, because otherwise they come back and they will try to wipe you out. But we never really resolve it, but it's been a big source of discussion.
Yeah, it's a very difficult problem, and it's ongoing. Yeah, Sylvia. Unmute. Please.
Done. Thank you. If I'm correct, this week's Parsha talks about Moses and the spies, correct?
Yeah, we just read it yesterday.
Right.
Theoretically.
Right. And again, there is a command to wipe out people who are there. Is there not?
Not exactly. It's not directly there. It comes later, but it's understood. People they understand that they're going to be involved in battle, right? They're preparing for battle. They're counted as troops, everybody that's eligible to fight.
They're
Later on, it's going to be made very explicit, wipe them out. Yes,
I mean, they're taking land. They're literally taking
right.
land.
The indigenous peoples, to use our
Right.
phrase from today, are or at least the latest indigenous peoples, because again, people came in and out and different people dispossessed previous peoples. But yes, the Torah says they have to be wiped out.
It just, I couldn't help but think about, our relationship these days to the indigenous people.
Yeah, yeah.
And forget the story of Israel and whatnot, but let's be very local.
So I hesitate to go over this ground again, but I've written about this a little bit, and this is not, what I'm going to say is not meant to be a facile pushing away of the problem, but I want to give a different analogy. The whole question of colonial conquest and genocides is a terrible, terrible question. And we have a terrible history as a human species of doing this. And the West has a terrible history of doing that. I want to, and again, people will find this moving or legitimate or acceptable or not. I want to shift how the Torah is talking about a situation which is not about colonialism. It's not about established powers taking over other people's societies and lands and resources and even persons, right? The Torah, the context of the Torah is, from the way the Torah tells the story, whether you believe it or not, that's the story is, for the Torah, the establishment for the first time since Adam and Eve, since Noah maybe, a monotheistic society. The Torah's picture of the world, and certainly the region where the Jewish people are functioning and first growing, right? They're a new people. They're a ragtag bunch of former slaves who a year before had just gotten out of Egypt. They were oppressed by this empire, and Egypt was a colonial empire. And the Babylonians were a colonial empire, and the Persians were a colonial empire. The Jewish people were a revolutionary people. They were a people that were rising up to say to the world, everything that you believe is wrong. There is only one God. That one God is our God, but that one God is your God also, whether you like it or not. And the fight for establishing a monotheistic beachhead is what the Torah is about. What I've brought into the discussion at other times is, here we are in the United States of America. The United States of America, a bunch of states that decided to unite together. And then what happens? In the middle of the 19th century, a whole bunch of states say they want to leave. They don't want to be part of the United States. They want to be their own group. We fight a civil war to prevent them from leaving the Union. 750,000 people die, right? From both sides, people are going out there to try to kill the other people, either for the sake of leaving the Union or keeping the Union, forcing people to stay in the Union. I believe, despite what some revisionist historians, I believe it was about, in the end, a moral choice about slavery. That in the end, the fighting that we did, the bloodshed, the destroying of cities, the killing of tens of thousands of people, was for the sake of establishing, no, we're going to have a country where slavery is going to be abolished. Eventually, it's going to be abolished. And the other side said, no, we don't want to have that kind of country. We're going to fight to the death so that we can enslave people. And guess what? Here we are, and we don't agonize, maybe because we don't have a weekly Constitution reading, or we don't have a weekly reading of American history. We have a weekly reading of the Torah, and we constantly agonize over the fact, how did we say such things? How did we think that such things were necessary? But when it comes to that battle, which was almost a genocide, we don't have any moral qualms about it, because we understand, or we think we understand, or we just don't want to think about it, which is most of the situation. But the people that think about it, it was a necessary, tragic fight. That's how I see what's going on in the Torah. What I see in the Torah is that this is about, if we don't fight, and if we don't wipe out Amalek, and if we don't wipe out this other group of people, there will not be a place to establish a monotheistic society. Now, that monotheistic society took hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to create, but it finally did take root. And for better or for worse, obviously we use monotheism, as a club to hit other people over the head, as well. But we wouldn't have the world that we had without fighting for it. That's how I approach this thing, with a very heavy heart, and with an acknowledgement of how easy it is to abuse these kinds of ideas and use them for your own agenda and for your own purposes and for your own power. Nevertheless, I think it's a good thing that the Civil War, I think it's a civil war. I think that it's a good thing that the North won the Civil War. I was just away for a vacation for a week, and we went to this island. The north of it is called Assateague, and the south of it is called Chincoteague.
Oh, yeah.
And the north is in Maryland, and the south is in Virginia. And we found out that Chincoteague, the place that's this island in Virginia, is the one place in Virginia that they voted not to secede from the Union.
Oh.
And their life was made miserable by Virginia, by the state of Virginia, because they were seen as traitors, and they were seen as the scum of the earth, because they refused to say, no, we want to have slavery as an ongoing institution. Every once in a while, there are fights that have some kind of moral and earth-shattering significance. That's the way the Torah wants to present the issue. We live so far away, and we live so comfortably already. With anybody can do anything they want. Monotheism, good. No religion, good. Everything, but we don't really appreciate that to establish this was a very, very difficult thing. And the Torah says it's worth it. And that's the question.
Can I just add an ironic thing? The Chincoteague is a place where liberal Washingtonians that I know go.
It's a sweet place.
Yeah.
We really had a great time. It's where these wild horses.
The wild horses.
Assateague has more wild horses, so Assateague is a little bit more of a place to see that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's a very nice place, and it hasn't been ruined by people like me, tourists. Okay. Put up with the ringing, and it'll go away eventually. Okay. Let's continue. Rabbi Chia.
Rabbi Chia introduced his lecture on Esther with an exposition on the following verse. Moreover, it shall come to pass that what I had thought to do to them, I will do to you.
Okay. Look at 37 for the background.
This verse immediately follows the one quoted in the previous note. God warns Israel that if they do not destroy their enemies, then Israel will suffer the fate intended for them. This threat was almost fulfilled in the times of Haman, when the Jewish people were on the verge of destruction. That's Rashi's interpretation.
Okay, good. So now, any further comments? Bill, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, it's not a substantive one. It's sort of a textual one. In both of these cases, but with Rabbi Levi and Rabbi Chia, and there comes one later on with Rabbi Hanina, the statement is Rabbi Levi introduced his exposition, but there's no exposition. There's just the state. There's just the quote.
Right, it's a fragment.
There's nothing else about it. And there's three of them like that on this page: Rabbi Levi, Rabbi Chia, and later on Rabbi Hanina. They mentioned the Torah verse, and then that's it. There's no discussion, no exposition, no nothing. Is that because it just got lost somewhere along the way?
Yeah, it was understood well enough so that they didn't continue with the rest of the record.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, good. And now back to the verse. So we already did Vayehi, right? Or Vayehi Bimei.
Yep.
Now we're up to the next word in the first verse of the Megillah, Achashverosh. Ahasuerus.
The Gemara resumes its exposition of the Megillah's narrative. Achashverosh. Rav gave an interpretation of the name Achashverosh, brother of the head, and of the same character as the head.
Okay, so what's the head? 39.
39 says a combination of Ahiv, brother of, and Rosh, head.
Okay, so Achashverosh is Achiv Shel Rosh, the brother of the head and of the same age, a contemporary of the head man. Who's the head man? This is explained.
This is explained. He was called brother of the head because he was the brother of the wicked Nebuchadnezzar, who was called the head. As it is said in reference to Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold. Achashverosh was of the same character as the head Nebuchadnezzar, inasmuch as Nebuchadnezzar killed and Achashverosh sought to kill. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple and Achashverosh sought to destroy the temple. As it is said, and during the reign of Achashverosh, at the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against all the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem.
Okay, so we've talked about this before also. What kind of light do we put Achashverosh on? Do we see Achashverosh as a nincompoop? Do we see him as an incompetent fool? Do we see him as somebody who's just too drunk to know what he's doing? Or do we actually blame him to a certain extent, along with Haman? Is he a wicked person also? So this approach is saying he's just in there the same way Nebuchadnezzar is one of the arch villains of Jewish history. Achashverosh should not be seen as a neutral character or even a funny character. He's bad. Okay, so we have the word Rosh as being applied to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the head of an empire. And then we have the similarities as well in terms of what their agendas were. So Nebuchadnezzar really did succeed in destroying the temple. Achashverosh comes next. He sought to destroy the temple. So here we get into some funny chronology, historical work. But now, which temple are we talking about? Now we're talking about the second temple. The verse that's quoted, and in the time during the reign of Achashverosh, at the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Okay, so this comes from, where is it?
Ezra.
From 42, from Ezra, not from Nehemiah. Okay, so let's read that note.
Ezra 4:6. During the reign of Cyrus, the king that preceded Ahasuerus, some exiles returned from Babylon to Jerusalem under the leadership of Zerubbabel and began building the second temple. However, pagan inhabitants of the land, the quote Samaritans, unquote, harassed the builders of the temple and succeeded in bringing its construction to a halt. When Ahasuerus ascended the throne, he participated in a slanderous attack on the returning Jewish exiles in order to prevent any resumption of the temple's construction.
Okay, so what we've done is we've gone fast forward a couple of generations, and now we're not at the first temple, which is what Nebuchadnezzar tried to destroy,
Okay.
but we're talking about the beginning of the restoration of the Second Commonwealth, which was done by permission of the Persian Emperor Cyrus, who had, overtaken the Babylonian Empire. And the way we have the chronology here is that Achashverosh is placed as the next generation after Cyrus. So Cyrus is like 516 BCE, and then Achashverosh is a little bit after that. So the Jews are given permission by Cyrus to come back into the land of Israel. 929 people. That's going to be the very end of the Tanakh. That's going to be that very last couple of verses of that's how the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, ends, with Cyrus giving permission. Anybody who wants to go up, to go back to your homeland and to serve God, Gesundheit. Gesundheit is the last word in the Tanakh. So so Cyrus gives that permission, but it's not so simple, because once the Jews come back, the small minority of people that comes back to Stuart's point, the rest of them, the majority of people are still in Babylonia, and they're sort of like sitting there fermenting, and they, end up coming back into the fore when we get the Babylonian Talmud. But for hundreds of years, there's this quiet, silent majority of the Jewish people. But for now, Cyrus gives permission, and we have a whole bunch of pioneering, idealistic people or adventurous people. It's like almost maybe a gold rush kind of thing. People coming back into the land of Judea to reestablish a Jewish commonwealth. And then the question is, how independent do they want to be? How do we view this startup nation, right? Are they going to be good boys and girls and always be loyal to the Persian Empire? Or are they taking advantage of the permission to go back and set up their Jewish homeland? But really, they really want to become completely independent, right? And this is a colonialist problem all the time, right? When do our colonies, when can we trust our colonies to be loyal colonies? And when, if we're too good to the colonies, do the colonies end up saying, no, we want to be independent? So this was a problem of how to view what was going on in Judea at this time. And different groups, depending on whether they liked what was going on or not, would make accusations back to the Persian authorities. Oh, those Jews that you gave them permission to come back, guess what? They're hatching plots. They're ready to start, going overboard, and they want to really be independent, and they want to be traitors, and they want to, go off on their own. And you're asking for trouble by allowing them to build a temple again and so on. So this is part of what happens. And here Achashverosh is mentioned in this verse, where opponents of the establishment of the Jewish Commonwealth are writing back to the Persian government, and he is sort of implicated as viewing this accusation positively. So Achashverosh is therefore seen as a person who's not a good friend of the Jewish people. He's a person who can't be trusted. Okay, so that's Rav's interpretation. He's a bad guy. Okay, Josie.
That Cyrus was an answer on Jeopardy, and
Really?
I knew it only because of your classes. Yeah.
Look at that. All right. So you made millions of dollars?
I think a couple of them got it right.
All right. Very good.
Everything's connected to everything.
Yeah.
Everything. Right. Okay. Let's see. Let's go a little bit further here.
Further interpretations of the name Achashverosh. Shmuel said.
Okay. Shmuel can never let Rav have the last word. So Shmuel says, no, I got something else to say.
He was called Achashverosh because in his time, the faces of the Jews became as dark as the bottom of a pot that has been blackened by fire.
All right. So he takes the word Achashverosh and he changes around the letters. Achashverosh becomes Shachor. Right? Instead of the Chash, Chet, Shin, it's Shin, Chet, Reish, and that Shachor is dark, black. Okay. So they became blackened as dark as the bottom of a pit. Why are their faces darkened?
Well, Rabbi Yochanan said he was called.
No. Why did according to Shmuel, what was the darkening of the faces? What was that all about?
I have no idea.
Okay, so do we have it in the note?
Well, it doesn't really explain that. It just explains the language part. The letters of Achashverosh can be arranged to spell Shachor,
Right.
black.
So that I said it. So what
Thus it-
that the blackening of the faces is the fact that V'ya'ir Shushan Navocha, right? That the Jews were put into dread for their lives, right? They fasted, and fasting is also something that is considered if you don't eat for a long time, you get darker, your skin gets darker, your face gets darker, and also the anguish of the Jewish people in their fear that they were going to be destroyed by Haman. So he allowed this to happen. So that's why he's called Achashverosh. So he's complicit in Haman's evil, even if he's not the main mover and shaker. Okay, another black spot against Achashverosh. Okay.
And Rabbi Yochanan said he was called Achashverosh because everyone who called him said, "Woe upon his head."
Oy. So the word Rosh is Rosh, and Ach, Oy.
Oy.
Oy vey. Right? So again, is this because he was complicit with Haman, or were people just driven crazy by the fact that he was such a terrible king? Not clear. Okay, one more.
And Rabbi Hanina said he was called Achashverosh because everyone became poor in his time, as it is said, and King Achashverosh levied taxes.
Okay, that comes from the very end of the Megillah. And in other words, his whole, very, very extravagant lifestyle as an emperor who wanted to have a very, very show-offy palace and so on and so forth. So he impoverished his whole people. It could have been a thriving empire. Instead, he took it all for himself. A story that we have encountered historically again and again and again. Right here, the word Rosh is not head, but Rosh. Rosh is poor, a poor person, impoverished. So he impoverished his kingdom. He wasted all the resources of the kingdom. The kingdom could have been wonderful, but instead he took it all for himself. Okay, we're going to stop here and we'll continue next time, I hope. Okay?
Yashikov.
Tigers into everybody.
Stay safe.